Welcome to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their heartline. I'm your host, Dr. Andrea Austin. I'm an emergency medicine physician, coach, and educator. I believe that healthcare needs to improve the quality care that patients receive and that supporting the workers is at the heart of this transformation. It is a very special treat to have Dr. Emily Sbiroli on the podcast. She is an emergency medicine physician, and she's also a resident that I had the privilege of training back in the day. And one of my favorite things about being in attending is when your residents become your colleagues and that they surpass you in areas of expertise and develop niches that are interesting and bringing so much value to the world. And I'm very excited to catch up with her and share her with our audience today. Hi, Emily.
Hello. Oh my gosh, that's quite an intro. I would definitely not say surpass, but I would for sure say, joining on the journey of trying to make change in medicine.
Yes, you are a change maker for sure. And I'm really excited to talk more about your expertise in climate medicine. But I want to start with your doctor origin story. Why did you become a physician?
Man, I feel like probably so many of us have written our personal statements about this, right? If you think about everyone's journey and, your medical school statement, and we're always reflecting on it, I feel like it's always a little bit different maybe every time we think about it. For me, I actually came to medicine through my work in sustainability and through my work in environmental science. I did study that in undergrad. I did environmental sustainability in my undergrad. And when I was in the job market at that time, it was around 2010 when I graduated college. The job market was kind of similar to what it was when I graduated residency. I wasn't too great. It was a pretty significant recession at the time. And working in the field of environmental sustainability just wasn't really filling my cup. I kind of was missing that person-to-person interaction and feeling like you could make a difference at work and in someone's life. So I was going to go to environmental engineering school. Before I had to do that, I had to take some extra kind of prerequisites for it because I didn't take things like bio, for example, or chemistry when I was studying in undergrad in my environmental sustainability degree. So I had to do a post-bac program anyway. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to try out medicine and see if I like it. And at the time, I was actually super squeamish, Andrea. I don't think you know this about me, but back in the day, I was super squeamish. I was the patient who would faint every single time you would get her blood drawn. I couldn't even put a contact lens in my eye without totally freaking out about it and having literal panic attacks and kind of thinkable episodes during that time. So I've come a very long way in terms of really overcoming that squeamishness and that fear. And now I'm, a board certified emergency medicine physician and seeing squeamish, gross stuff all the time and totally okay with it. So in terms of what really kind of inspired me to make the transition from sustainability to medicine was that I realized at the time that healthy people would be more likely to make healthy choices for the environment and make healthy kind of lifestyle choices. And kind of vice versa, a healthy environment tended to empower people to think about their health more if they were living in a place that was a bit more clean energy or sustainably minded. So that was kind of the transition for me was, hey, you know what? Maybe if I worked on people and kind of worked on this from a people angle, worked on it from their health and really tried to make that connection between the environment and our health, I think I could do it. I think I could be a good doctor and do both, And so I was able to go to medical school at SUNY downstate in Brooklyn. While I was a med student there, I was involved in some kind of wilderness type medicine subgroups. I was really interested in women's health at the time, public health at the time. And then it really kind of merged when I was a resident, when I was really working in the hospital, working in these clinical settings. And seeing, wow, there's so much waste here. There's just so much more we could be doing from a sustainability perspective that the rest of the industry and other industries are really moving forward in that I had been exposed to in kind of my previous career. and really seeing the healthcare sector lagging behind everyone else, really. And it was, bothersome. So I just kind of joined the movement when I was a resident, and then did my fellowship within a diploma in climate medicine and the National Physician Fellowship in Climate and Health Science Policy with the University of Colorado. I did that after I finished residence. And now I'm here, and now I'm still in that field and course director for their sustainability and healthcare course. I do consulting, I do lots of stuff that overfill my cup, I would say, at this point.
I want to go back to something that you said, which I think is very unusual. So I think a lot of people have this feeling that if you get grossed out by stuff, there's no way you could overcome it. Because sometimes medical students or people that want to be a medical student, listen to this podcast. How did you overcome that aversion to a lot of the challenging parts of being a doctor?
Yeah, I think for me it was interesting because I don't have many doctors in my family. I had my mother and my uncle on my father's side, whom I'm very close with, both kind of tried to go into medicine and neither one ended up finishing. One of them because, they were a little bit squeamish and they couldn't really do it. So for me, in my mind, when I was going through those moments, I really had this kind of belief that if I could just get over that squeamishness and get over these literal syncopal episodes and this kind of fear and anxiety that would happen, if I could just get over that kind of visceral hang up, that I could be a good doctor, that I loved science at the time. I loved people. I was a good critical thinker and I was a great kind of people person, and I really just kind of felt that I could do it, if I could just get over this one thing that was really a problem, to be able to perform and be a physician. So I took it in pieces. I took it step by step. The first was I just tried to put a contact lens in my eye without freaking out about it and without feeling super squeamish. In order to get over that, I brought one of my best friends with me to my eye doctor appointment. No one else was really able to kind of talk sense into me except one of my best girlfriends. Her name is Abigail. So shout out to Abigail right now. And she brought me to my appointment. I was like, dude, you just need to just tell me I'm being crazy because, she wears contacts. All my friends wears contacts. Why can't I? Right. This was kind of the question in my head, right? There's so many people, so many doctors, so many nurses, hundreds of thousands of people in this field, and they seem to be able to get over this, right? This seems to not be a problem. So for me, I was like, there must be a way that the average person like myself can just get over it and do it. So it's just a matter of me trying to figure out what were the avenues that would help me feel comfortable enough to really move forward. So for the contact lenses, my friend brought me in and I was like freaking out with the doctor. He's like, yeah, I'd already been there like 6 times, trying every time, fainting every single time. This poor ophthalmologist that was trying to teach me how to put a contact lens in my eye. And finally, my friend just like looked at me while I was having this freak out and she was just like, dude, calm down. What are you doing? This is not a problem. You are so much bigger than this. You are so much stronger than this. This is just a tiny piece of, plastic or silicone, whatever it was that you put in your eye. She's like, you can do this. And I did, and afterwards I just did. I just kind of stuck it in my eye and I realized, okay, this isn't that bad. And I'm not fainting. And okay, and even when the symptoms were coming on, when I was like, okay, well, I'm getting lightheaded, I'm getting palpitations. How do I move out of it? Okay, well, I've had this before and I didn't die and it wasn't dangerous and I was able to get through it all these other times before. So let me see if I could just ride this one out. And kind of once I did the first one, I kind of just took those moments and brought them into the next times when I was getting squeamish. So another time would be I was doing lab work on mice, and I was working for a pediatric surgery department at Columbia and I was a research intern there and we had to do a lot of mouse work and I was fainting every time I had to harvest the little mouse organs for this pediatric surgery unit. We were studying tumors and these little mice would grow tumors and we had to harvest all their organs and open them up and literally dissect them. was fainting every time, for that. Forget it. That was like totally squeamish and gross to me. But then I would kind of, as I was doing it, I would walk myself through it and I'd be like, okay, this is just skin. I'm cutting through skin. And what is skin? Okay, skin is just a bunch of layers of cells. Okay, what are cells? Well, I remember learning about it in my biology class. I just took that exam. A cell is just a membrane and it's just made of proteins. It was kind of like a piece by piece, I guess, dissection, you would call it, or piece by piece breaking down of what is this thing that's scaring me so much and what is it made of? And what are these pieces? What are they really? And are the individual pieces themselves scary? Or, is there a reason for me to worry? So I was able to get through it that way, and blood, when I would see blood, I'd be like, okay, what actually is blood? Well, blood is something really important for us to survive. It's made of, again, little tiny, cute donut shaped little red cells. And it's in this plasma that's just a clear fluid and only looks red because there's so many of them. And doesn't mean that there's something life threatening going on if I see blood. It's just part of the human body and part of biology, and it's normal. So I was able to kind of do it that way. And it carried with me a little bit through medical school. Every year it'd get less and less and less until eventually I got into, at the end of my med school, kind of beginning of residency, when I remember I was putting in my first central line and I started kind of getting those psychosomatic, kind of those somatic symptoms with the palpitations and the syncopal type feelings, and being like, okay, now is absolutely not the time to faint because you're with a patient and this person really needs you. And I think that switch in my head was like, all right, you need to actually be there for this person. And whatever like silly fears you have in the past really don't matter right now. Just be there and you can do it. Go faint later, go faint in the bathroom later when, no one's watching. And then that kind of shifted it for me. And I haven't felt anything since. I haven't had any issues since then. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but it's kind of the first time I think I've ever really shared it in that much depth with anyone. So yeah.
Thank you. I think that's such a powerful message. And I heard so many things in there that are really based in, this psychology literature. One of my favorite books is Emotional Agility by Susan David. And what you're describing there is you were stepping out. You were observing, I'm having this reaction. I see myself doing it and I'm thinking about this. Why am I doing this? It's metacognition there. Like, why am I thinking this way? Is this a thought distortion? So I love to talk about this on this podcast is we have thought distortions. So, we can fixate on the gross parts, but it's like, okay, yeah, this is a little gross, but I have to kind of get over it to be able to do my job, which is really meaningful work. So I think you just outlined something so beautiful there. And I'm curious now too, because you've had that experience, we see a lot of patients in the emergency department that come in with panic attacks and, that may have symptoms like this. What's your reaction when you interact with them? Because to be honest, some of us who haven't had that, it's very easy to be othering to those patients.
Yeah, no, I definitely have empathy for them. I've been there. I totally feel what they're going through. I do find it hard sometimes, though, to kind of talk to them because I know in the moment at least when I'm going through that stuff or when I had it, it doesn't quite matter what someone else is saying to you. You really have to have worked through it before to get the tools to then apply them. So when I was going through my training and having these issues with panic, I did have a therapist, at the time. And the therapist was a behavioral cognitive type therapist. And he would be like, okay, well, next time you feel this, here are some things in your toolbox that you can use to apply. In the moment, it's hard though. If you didn't already think about those things and prior or kind of prepare something to think about when you have those moments of panic, it's not that easy. So I think for me, when I see those patients, I really try to treat the symptoms And if they're having palpitations, I'll do a propranolol. If they're having more of like the muscle type of, contractions and spasms and things, I'll do a benzo. And I'll just be a little bit more liberal in my treatment of them and kind of try not to write it off, because I know how scary those symptomatic feelings could be. If they're feeling syncopal or lightheaded, I might give them a liter of fluids, even if their vital signs are okay, just to make them feel like they're getting something. So I am a little bit more liberal with that. And then I do try to say at the end, hey, maybe if this is something that's altering your life or inhibiting you from moving forward, maybe you should really think about figuring out ways to have a toolbox before these things happen, so that when they do, it doesn't take over your life, which is kind of what it was doing for me. Like, it was preventing me from achieving my career goals, and what did I wanted to do in my life and what kind of job I wanted to have. So I would say, that's kind of how I approach those folks in the ER. Yeah.
I love that so much. I want to pivot now to what you brought up. And I thought this is fascinating. I didn't know your undergraduate background was sustainability. And so you mentioned that you do climate medicine, which, for some listeners, they may not really be sure what that is. I honestly didn't know it was a field until I had met you more than a few years ago now. So can you walk us through what is climate medicine?
Yeah. So climate medicine, I would say, is an interdisciplinary field of medicine where a clinician is trained in recognizing the health impacts of climate change or the health impacts of the environment on their patients. And in addition, tries to practice in a climate conscious manner, recognizing that the care we are delivering is affecting the planet in the same way that every other industry is affecting the planet, and being conscious of how do we mitigate our climate footprint. That's kind of it in like a nutshell. It is a very new field. So yeah, I mean, even when you met me, Andrea, a few years ago, there were only a couple of physicians in the country formally trained in this, and a couple of them were just in EM. It started in EM in our field. Now we run a course. There's over 25 clinicians in each certificate that we run. We have 5 of them. We have a waiting list of over several hundred physicians waiting to learn about this kind of stuff. So it has absolutely exploded, I would say, in the last several years. And I think it's mostly being driven by the younger generations, by Gen Z and millennials. If you look at many polls, Gen Z and millennials are the generations most concerned with climate change and environmental sustainability, and what are we doing for it? And that's just across the board in the population. And that, of course, is now being reflected in medicine. You have more trainees and you have more medical students coming in with these questions. What are we doing for our climate footprint? It's hard for them to really go from a mindset where they grew up in a world where everyone's talking about climate change and environmental impact, and then they go to a hospital or they go to their medical school or they go to their residency training and no one is talking about it. No one is doing anything. They're going to be the ones to really raise a voice. So what we're seeing is a huge explosion in the younger generations, for sure, who are interested in these problems and who want to be able to practice medicine in a more conscious way.
I love that. Let's make it really practical for the listener. Let's say you are CEO of a hospital for a day. What are your top 3 things that you would say, hey, you're changing these things effective immediately because these are low-hanging fruit and also really impactful?
Wow, that's an amazing question. I really want to use that day well if I was the CEO. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is how tiered this problem really is, and how folks at different levels can really get involved. So what the CEO of the hospital will do on a daily basis is probably different from what a clinician, what you or I, like the boots on the ground folks, would do on a daily basis. But the point of this field and the point of the interdisciplinary aspect of climate medicine is that everybody needs to be at the table. It doesn't matter where you are in the hospital or where you work. If you're in facilities, if you're a medical student, if you're a nurse, if you're the CEO, the table is the same and the problem is the same. and everybody needs to get together to be able to solve these issues. So for a CEO perspective, if I was like, and this would be the dream, to be honest, would be the Emily's, sustainable hospital. And then you just come in and it's a beautiful green hospital with windows and, amazing water features and no, crazy lights that are fluorescent. You just have just a totally beautiful place. From a CEO's perspective, I would say recognizing the connection and the role that the emergency room and the hospital has in defending patients' rights when it comes to climate inequities, when it comes to environmental inequities, especially if you're in a hospital that's more an underserved area. One of the places I work at is right on the border of Tijuana. And so we see a lot of underserved patients there. And I see, differences in how these climate impacts, how climate change is actually affecting some of these folks. So I would say, first, on a macro type level, being aware that the hospital is going to be the one that will share with their patients and share with the community, hey, climate is affecting your health, right? Air pollution affects your health. You might have a horrible asthma exacerbation because the air quality is so poor. And as your hospital, as your healthcare provider, I'm going to let you know that in this heat wave, for example, you might be at risk for exacerbations in CHF, for stroke, if you have like cardiovascular disease. As the healthcare system, I want to be the one that's sounding the alarm bell for the vulnerable patients. That's kind of what I would do on day one if I were the CEO. From there, the care is the same. And I think that's the message that I am most interested in sharing, is that physicians kind of feel like, well, or clinicians, well, there's not much I can do because I don't know much about it. I don't know much about this problem. I don't know much about environmental sustainability. So what can I really do? But do you know how to treat a patient with an asthma exacerbation? Do you know how to treat a patient with heat stroke or heat illness? Do you know how to treat a CHF exacerbation? Yes, you do. And these are the cases that come in to the hospital. These are the cases that the hospital needs to be aware of when there are environmental events going on. These are the patients that are vulnerable. Do you know how to treat a homeless patient and what their risk factors might be? Should they be outside in a heat wave? No, probably not, right? So this is the kind of bridge, or at least the what I learned in my field at this point, and as a clinical medicine or climate doc, we call ourselves, that you don't have to actually reinvent the wheel. You just have to be there to make the connections as to like, these are the problems going on. And then same thing from healthcare delivery perspective. As the second thing I would do as a CEO is really looking at clinical care and is it efficient? And what is our climate footprint of clinical delivery, of care delivery? So I would, if my hospital does not have a greenhouse gas inventory, which the 3 hospitals that I work at do not have greenhouse gas inventories, the first one I would do is, well, we need to measure what our emissions are before we can even make meaningful change. So getting a team together to make an actual greenhouse gas inventory and figuring out where our largest emissions are for our particular hospital, that would be number 2 on the list of things to do.
Wow. That is just, I love the message that you're sending, that everybody in the healthcare organization has a role in addressing this problem and has potential solutions. And also emphasizing, as our emergency departments are increasingly crowded, one of the other drivers of this is climate's impact on health. I just listened to a story about the heat waves in Arizona and the number of patients that come in with this very late stage heat illness. And it's just heartbreaking. And then the worst part is, so if you do manage to save someone's life that's come in with these crazy temperatures of 106 or 107, what happens at the end? We know all too well that a lot of our patients that suffer from a lack of housing, we don't fix that for them in the emergency department. We send them back out to the environment that puts them at very high risk, increasingly high risk. for these key illnesses and exacerbations of their underlying medical problems. And that ties into this idea of moral injury. So I'm curious how you deal with that, because you care about the climate a lot. I know that this is, something that is profoundly impactful to you. And emergency medicine is hard right now. Like, certainly this isn't the only issue that's making our specialty hard. So how are you finding a way to hold the very real moral injury that you inevitably know you're walking into every shift?
Yeah.
How do you keep showing up?
It's so funny you mentioned that, because I was talking to some of my other climate colleagues about it. And it's funny because we're all in different specialties. So there's, family medicine, there's neurology, there's psych, just kind of everybody. We were talking about exactly the same thing where we're like, hey, we're like particularly burned out in this field in a way, because not only does healthcare just burn everybody out, but now we're also dealing with climate change, which feels like another insurmountable, monster in the distance, right? That's just looming over everything. And so how do you, every day of my life is just, okay, I'm either emergency medicine minded and I'm still a full-time ER doc and I still do my shifts and I'm trying to deal with that. And then in my quote unquote downtime or my quote unquote off time, I'm doing things related to environmental sustainability, which again is another area where we're trying to make momentum, but there's just so many obstacles and there's just so many, reasons to give up. To be honest, Andrea, I would love to riff with you on this because if you have any great ideas, because I know you're much more educated than I am in this kind of space and thinking about these issues. But I would say, at least on the surface, I think just having my wolf pack, I call them, of women, of friends that we can rip with and just kind of go through the horrible days with, when it's an EM, like send a text to, my good friends on shift and be like, wow, that shift sucks. Do you want to go get a beer? Like, yes, I do. Let's go do that. And then same with climate, like, oh man, guys, there's another heat wave. Here's a horrible article about it. Like, well, is anyone doing anything cool at their hospital? Well, yeah, I just, did a study about, decreasing waste in my ICU. So that's kind of cool. Just maybe sharing wins, I would say, are the ways to kind of keep us going. I don't know. I think I still have some juice in me. I'm only 3 years out from residency. So I think I still have some juice that I can squeeze, and a certain reserve. Maybe I'm not on the complete burnout spectrum. I'm fully there yet, but I don't know. I think doing at least the climate work in a way balances out the medicine problem, because I feel even if I can't, horrible shift in the ED, for example, or you feel like you couldn't really make a difference in anyone's life because everyone's mad at you. Everyone was waiting 9 hours before they saw you. ED was boarding. You forgot to get the patient a blanket when they asked you for one, and then they're mad at you, right? And then you kind of go home and it's like, all right, well, I feel like at least now I'm also working on a much larger macro problem that will affect many lives if I can make some sort of dent, as opposed to just focusing on that one life or that one individual that maybe I didn't feel like I was able to fully help in that moment. The climate and sustainability work is like, okay, well, at least I'm working on this study that is, trying to reduce plastic in healthcare, and that's going to help a lot of people, and so that's one of the ways I think to kind of balance and counterbalance. And the same thing with, on the other hand, with the climate work, right? If we try to pass a bill and it doesn't go through and we couldn't get, the California legislator to agree to, setting higher standards for air quality and things like that, then it's like, all right, well, at least I can go to the ED and here's an ankle fracture I can reduce. And now you feel better, patient. Now you can go home. It's kind of taking the wins, I think, and really kind of focusing on the wins, maybe. I don't know. What do you do, Andrea? I want to know what you do.
I think these are really wonderful things that you shared. And in my conversations with change makers and in the research that I'm doing on change makers, I think the number one thing is having a sense of your agency. So what you just described there is, I felt agency that I matter, that I have self-efficacy, that I reduced this ankle fracture, or I, put together something that was used to present to the state legislature on climate change. I did that. So that's really, really important. And I think one of the things physicians and healthcare professionals can fall into the trap in is minimizing the impact that you have. So agency is really important. And then the other things I heard in there that resonate with the themes and the research that I'm seeing is you got to care. I mean, if you don't care, if you're apathetic, this work is just soul crushing. And I think some people think apathy is protective. It's really not in the long run. But when you care, you also have to have boundaries. And you have to have a sense of where you are on that. And healthcare professionals a lot of times don't have great boundaries. And especially, I think, going through medical school, we're strict of boundaries a lot. So what you just described, this monumental challenge of how are we going to overcome climate change and how are we going to do that in a healthcare context where, a lot of the materials we use in healthcare are plastic, which I want to come back to plastics in a moment. Those are really, to me, what people need. You need the agency and you need to care. And you've got to have the boundaries. And if any of those get out of alignment, the burnout's coming. It's coming for you.
Yeah. 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 I totally agree with that. I mean, I think part of one of the ways I think for me to kind of, again, this idea of taking it piece by piece and kind of problem by problem instead of trying to get overwhelmed by the entire issue and just being like, okay, what are the pieces that I can really, that are affecting me right now? And what are the pieces that are filling my cup, right? Because there's so many things we can choose to do and even in the ED and in environmental work as well. Kind of like, yes, everything seems like it's relevant. Everything seems like, it could be potentially helpful. But are all of those filling your personal cup, right? Are you personally interested in those things? So at least for me, for example, is I found that even though policy work and writing letters to legislators and things like that and doing those phone calls is helpful, it wasn't really filling my cup. So I don't do it as much anymore. Even though folks still ask me to do it, I'll kind of participate in it. But I don't quite do it because it's not as interesting to me as, for example, doing a greenhouse gas inventory for a practice that wants to go green, So kind of like to figuring out, and I use the fill your cup analogy because I've heard that from you, Andrea, from your work and from your podcast. Like, I just love that image of, what is filling my cup. And so what do I want my cup to look like? How are the things in my cup nourishing me? Right? If it's not policy, for example, anymore, then I'm not going to do it. We have limited time. But I'll do the things that I think about every day and obsess over every day, which is nerdy enough for me, greenhouse gas inventories, right? Like, what is the climate footprint of this thing that I'm doing, or this thing that I'm drinking, or this thing that I have in my hand, or this medical device, right? What is that? And so kind of parsing it out and being piece by piece, like, yes, this all, I'm interested in all of this and I'm passionate about all of this, but figuring out what's really filling my cup, what's really giving me that joy and like the biggest bang for your buck in a way. I don't know if that makes sense.
It totally does. I mean, what you're describing again is that metacognition piece of like in that reflection of, and also like a humbleness, like it's this line between being humble and like recognizing what your strengths are, what, may be interesting to you, but it's not really my strength. And then also having that ability to say, yeah, I know myself, and this is how I want to use my special gift. This is what fills my cup. I'm good at this, which gets into the concept of ikigai, what I love doing, what the world needs, what I can be paid for. And so ikigai is a Japanese word. So that's a really key concept too, that, I had no idea what ikigai was probably until a couple of years ago. So I think if we can help young physicians healthcare professionals find their ikigais earlier, that is also going to really decrease the burnout. What's your take on the role of student loan debt and the threat to people following their ikigai and the relation of student loan debt to burnout?
I'm so happy to kind of talk about that, because the student loan question for me actually brought up a much larger personal finance question, right? So when I was a resident and medical student, I know so many of us resonate with this. We did not have an education at all in personal finance and what these massive debt loans really meant for our personal finance and how to even think about your financial life over the long term, which is crazy because you think about, okay, well, we're in a class of folks who, sure, like by the society standards, we're going to be kind of, higher earners on that side of the spectrum. And at the same time, we carry the most amount of student debt, compared to other fields. And so how is it possible that we kind of go through all of our training, all of our medical school residency training without any education? So for me, Andrea, also, that was totally a huge part in even just feeling empowered enough to pursue my other interests. So to even say, I want to do sustainability work or I want to work X amount of shifts. How do I even know what I wanted if I didn't understand my own personal finance? I mean, I will be full disclosure. I graduated. I had no idea what a fund is. What is a retirement account? What is, even a high yield savings account? What is a credit score? Like I literally didn't have any baseline education, like a financial education at all. My parents were from Italy, and they're from a system that's totally socialized, and has a totally different way of supporting their society there and their people. So they didn't really have a sense for me of, okay, well, now you need to open a retirement account or you have a retirement account. This is what it is. And sure, yeah, just take the student loans. We don't know what that means, but go ahead. Yeah, take them, right? They had no idea. I had no education at all. So once I graduated and I saw, at the time we were in the COVID kind of forbearance part. So I didn't actually have to start making my payments again until I guess it was like 2022 or beginning of 2023, because almost all of my loans are federal loans. So I did have that pause, which I took advantage of. And, I was just like, all right, well, if I don't have to pay, I'm not going to do it. I don't know what this means. But once I started having to pay, I was like, all right, well, now I'm scared. Like, can I pay my bills? Like, we have a mortgage. Like, can I pay my mortgage? Like, am I saving for retirement? Do I have an account? I'm an independent contractor. I don't have an employee, 401k or something like that. I have to make it myself. And I found myself, relying on all these other, frankly, finance bros and all these finance dudes and accountants who were like, no, yeah, just put it in this, put it in that. And I had no idea what any of this meant. So I took a personal journey for, I would say, the past year. I would say this month is 1 year where I was like, no, I'm going to learn about personal finance. I'm going to learn how I should be budgeting, how I should think about my future. How much money do I actually need in retirement to live comfortably and set my goals that way? And then where do my student loans really fall into it? How do I now take care of these massive loans? Full disclosure, I have like 240,000 in loans that I still need to deal with. So how do I build my life, around that? And it has been the most empowering experience of my life, to be honest with you, to go and learn about personal finance, learn about investing, learn about how do I make a budget? How do I save each month? What are my buckets of money that I have? What's my disposable income? What's not disposable? It has been the most empowering thing because it now gives me the peace of mind where I'm like, okay, now I have my money understood. I know where my loans are kind of falling into it. I have a better sense now of what I'm looking for in my loans. So I started learning about interest rates more. What is compound interest? How does that work? What are the interest rates that will help me achieve my financial goals? So for example, pay off the loans that have a higher interest rate, more than 7%, which is typically, what the stock market would make inflation wise. I know I'm not talking that specific right now, but in that sense, it was learning, what are the loans? How do I pay them off in a sensible way that also does not inhibit my long-term plans where we want to buy property. I want to have X amount in my retirement account. I want to invest a certain amount. I want to save another amount in a high yield savings account. I want to do all these other things. And so it's been the most empowering thing. And now, since that kind of, I would say, aspect of my life feels very under my control, before it felt completely out of my control, that 240,000 student loan debt no longer is scary, even though it still exists as the same number and the same monthly payment. It's way, way, way less scary because I understand the role that it's playing in the larger context of my financial goals, if that makes sense. I know that's long-winded, but that's kind of what changed my life.
I love it because, again, this is like the theme of the podcast, right? What you just did there is you owned your own agency. You said, because I think, honestly, I had some student loan debt, but a lot less because I was in the military. Like everything, though, one of my favorite equations was shared to me by the whole physicians, which I know you got to meet them, that, suffering equals pain times resistance. So the pain is your student loans. They're there. If you took them out, they are a reality. And the resistance is a lot of times is how upset you are about it, that it's not fair. Maybe I didn't understand how, big this was going to be. And I thought physician pay was going to be more, because we know that physician pay, effectively we've lost money, right? Because the Medicare rates haven't gone up. And, we work in the emergency department, and, there's a statistic out there that only 30% of patients that go through an emergency department actually pay the bill associated with their care. Because if you're on Medicare or Medicaid, the state and federal government does not pay at a rate that covers the associated care of their visit.
Yeah.
So,
oh my gosh.
So it's just like mind-boggling. And so those are all facts. There's some things we could do, some advocacy work, sure. But at the end of the day, that's not going to make your student loans go down. We can pray that they're all going to be wiped off the map. And I wish they would. But honestly, I think for high income earners, that's less likely to happen. So we're still left with this reality that we're upset about. But then the question is, so what are you going to do about that? And to play the victim, most of us want to go through that. It's a phase you need to go through.
Yeah.
But then once you get done with that, what are you going to do? And, how are you going to use your agency to get these paid off? And people do. It's not a myth. Yeah. People do pay off their student loans, even numbers as large as yours and larger. So I love that message. And that we can have the power of and you're paying your student loans off, and you wish other people didn't have to have this amount of debt. We can have both things at the same time. We can be working to pay down our debts and then be working to make the world better for the people coming up behind us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I applaud that.
As we start to wind down, there's one thing on my mind that's been bothering me a lot. We could probably do a whole podcast episode on it, but can you talk to us a little bit about microplastics? Because here's my prediction. Yes. My prediction is that microplastics is going to be the environmental crisis of our generation. And we're going to find out that fertility and cancer and all these various things trace back to microplastics. And I'm really scared. I've had several people close to me recently be diagnosed with cancer, and it's been awful and surprising at their age. Not to use anecdote as a form of evidence, but I do want to use that as a backdrop right now for what's going on with microplastics. And is there anything we can do as individuals to protect ourselves and then also not contribute so much to the problem?
Oh my gosh, this is such a, yes, we could do many podcasts about this. So yeah, I agree, Andrew. I mean, microplastics are, in my opinion, more of an imminent threat than climate change. And I know that's a spicy take for my field, and I can
Bring
already
it.
hear I already hear my Colorado colleagues mad at me for saying that. But I really do think it is for all of the reasons that you just said. It's funny. Did you happen to see there were two studies that were published this year about specifically microplastic being found in various places in the human body? Yeah.
Including sperm.
Yep. Testicular tissue. Yeah. Which
Crazy.
which is crazy. I mean, there's so much work already out there. The Endocrine Society has put out amazing papers and reviews on these things of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that are out there. Over 90% of them are associated with plastics. In the healthcare sector, like you and I, we're exposed, in my opinion, we're exposed to these things even more than the average person because we're dealing with these intense chemicals all day long that are used in hospitals. And yeah, it was those papers that were done. One was the testicular tissue one that where they literally found pieces of microplastic, like tiny pieces of plastic with an electron microscope. And that's like a buzzword from maybe medical school, if you guys remember, like what an electron microscope looks at. But literal physical pieces of plastic in between the cells of testicular tissue. And of course, has been absolutely associated with increased rates of reproductive cancers, increased rates of infertility. And then it affects every body system. I mean, they're finding connections between everything. Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, there's obesogens that are these chemicals, these endocrine disruptors that actually are associated with obesity, just independent of any other risk factors, like if they're sedentary lifestyle, smoking, things like that. Independent of those, there's obesogens that are making folks overweight. I mean, it's just totally insane. And to me, I mean, these two studies, the one with the testicular tissue, there's also another one where they found them in atheromas and internal carotid artery plaques. Same thing, little teeny tiny pieces of microplastic in the plaques of these patients who had strokes and things like that. And they found that it was a 4.5 times increased risk of folks who had plastics for them getting things like stroke. They had a 4.5% increased risk of stroke. And I'll send you the two papers too after if you want to take a look at them. So, I mean, to me, just those two studies alone, should be headlines in New York Times and every major media outlet. That's like, guys, this is now fully in our bodies. This is in everyone's bodies. And the testicular tissue one, it was 100% of the subjects, the test subjects in the study had it, including the dogs. They looked at canine testicular tissue and it was 100% of the test subjects and dogs as well. I mean, it's just so ubiquitous. To me, the fact that it's not on every major media outlet is crazy. I mean, this is a huge, 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 huge crisis. And I think, tackling it is going to be particularly challenging in many different ways. The first reason is because plastics are so tied so closely with the fossil fuel industry. 95% of plastics come from the fossil fuel industry. They're derived from fossil fuels and petrochemicals, 95% of plastic, which is a lot of money. And if the climate kind of movement and the climate change, movement has met the most resistance, it's with changing anything in the fossil fuel industry. And so now we got to take away one of your best products and your biggest money makers, which is plastic. And now we're going to tell you that it's going in everyone's health and making everyone sick and force them to now change that as well. I don't know. I honestly don't know. There's just so much resistance in that industry to any change because it's so lucrative for everybody involved. And it's so tied up with international affairs and political affairs and all these kind of foreign relations that I don't know anything about. And I prefer not to, because it's just so, if that's going to cause burnout in me, I think that's going to be it, is trying to figure out, all the political ties behind all of this. So that's the first kind of problem I see with plastics, is really how do we how do we move the industry away from making them? The second is that the alternatives that are out there aren't necessarily proven to be better. There's so many petrochemicals, there's tens of thousands of them, and only a handful of them, like a couple hundred maybe, are actually studied in terms of what are the effects on human health and how is it interacting with the body. There's a great group called the Environmental Working Group that does a lot on this, and how maybe some folks are familiar if you're someone who wants to choose like quote unquote cleaner products and products better for the environment. That's one way, one group that's doing a lot of great work with that. So there's that kind of aspect of it is we don't even really know what these chemicals are doing and what these plastics are doing when they interact with the environment and when they interact with our health. And then the third huge problem that I find is studying this and really making a strong kind of data-driven case is going to be very difficult because number one, these plastics were never intended technically for human consumption. So like, for example, that plastic carton where you're getting your salad in, right? Or the IV tubing and things like that, or the things you're handling at work, like all the plastics, right? Whatever, I'm just picking off the top of my head, like a plastic speculum or something. They weren't actually invented and created for human consumption. So they got to bypass a lot of regulations with that. But what's happening is that these plastics, when we throw them out and they enter the waste stream, they enter the food chain and they enter the water cycle because they're in landfills and they're degrading. And these plastics are not degrading in the same way that a piece of paper would degrade, for example, where it just becomes a different matter in and of itself. These plastics are just becoming tiny and tiny and tiny smaller versions of themselves that is entering our food chain. And now we're consuming them when initially they were not intended for us to do that. So we have no idea how to even really study that, because in order to do a randomized controlled trial, which would be the gold standard on how to really make the case, okay, get rid of this plastic, get rid of this chemical. In order to do that randomized controlled trial, you have all these ethical issues where it's like, now you're going to expose a group of patients to something that causes harm, which are these chemicals that were not intended for human consumption in some way. And you're comparing them to a group that is not going to be exposed to that harm. Like no IRB is ever going to approve that. So we're kind of in this rock and hard place where it's going to be really difficult to try and make the case for getting rid of these things and really moving them out of our environment, because they're always going to be like, well, what's the data, really behind it? And it's kind of like, well, we don't really have that because there were so many ways that these things got into our lives by bypassing so many other regulations that now they're just ubiquitous. So I don't have, this is like, as you said, like, this is a really long conversation. How do we avoid it? How do we deal with this? It's a very large, multifaceted problem. I would say I can send it to you too afterwards. The Endocrine Society does have great guidelines on just being aware of where some of these harmful chemicals and microplastics are really coming from and just removing your exposure to them, So like things in beauty products like phthalates and stuff like that. And so there are ways to kind of avoid it and minimize your exposure as much as possible. But beyond that, as an individual, we're going to need really collective, large-scale movements and regulation, frankly, to really get these massive, like, money-making companies and industries to stop using these products, But there's a model in Europe. So, for example, when they start doing their regulations for getting rid of these types of products and these petrochemicals and things like that, they kind of have like a zero tolerance policy where if anywhere down the line, this chemical, chemical X was shown to possibly negatively impact human health, they ban it. Whereas in the US, our FDA and kind of our regulatory bodies, they have a more like risk related assessment. So it's like, well, what is the smallest amount of exposure that we can have to this thing that will lead to a health impact? So it's kind of like, even if you're exposed to a little bit of it, it's not a big deal because they think, the studies aren't really showing that it's having much of a health impact. So they won't really ban it. It's called kind of like a risk hazard assessment, they call it, as opposed to a harm hazard assessment. So Europe, for example, they kind of, if there's any inkling that it's not good for humans, they get rid of it. Whereas the US, it's a little bit more complicated and they're more like, okay, well, how much is it really increasing people's risk if they are exposed to it? So it's a totally different kind of mindset, different framework. And you can see how it is open for loopholes. It could be open for any interpretation. It's much more open to interpretation that way. But there is a model, other countries are aware and they're kind of doing it. And I think if we can just show, in the US that, hey, look, these models are working in other places, maybe they'll kind of come around, to it. I don't know, it's kind of I hate that. I want to give messages of hope, but I also want to give messages of caution because you just have to be cautious right now. We're kind of in a world, as you said, where all these connections are being made. Absolutely. There's higher risk rates of cancer in younger and younger people. Like, is it because our DNA is changing evolutionarily? I mean, I personally don't think so. I think it's all of these chemicals in the environment that we're exposed to constantly that our grandparents and parents were not exposed to as often.
Wow. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back on the podcast to talk more about that. But as we wind down, we just talked about some heavy stuff. What's keeping you optimistic? What's keeping you going?
Ooh, I love that. Yeah. What's keeping me going is a lot of the work that I do. I work with trainees still. I work with students. I work with kind of up and coming medical students, residents who are really, really interested in this work. The ideas that are coming down from the younger generation, the enthusiasm, the passion, and frankly, the kind of baseline awareness and education is so much better than what it was even when I just started 7-8 years ago in this kind of climate medicine world. It's just incredible. One of the jobs I have is I work on the Physician Advisory Council with Healthcare Without Harm, and I help with the Emerging Physician Leader Award system. And so every year I get to look at all the work that medical students are submitting and residents submitting, all these ideas for projects, what they're doing. And it's just every year the caliber is just exponentially better. And it's just so inspiring. And so many more folks are getting involved where it's like, okay, I feel like the burden, like the distribution of burden is now kind of spreading out more and more. So I feel more like my wolf pack is growing, I feel like I have more folks that are in it and that are committed and that are ready to really do something about it, for better or worse. So for me, really interacting with that up and coming generation where they're so engaged and they're so interested, like absolutely gives me hope and fills my cup. I'm just personally waiting like everybody else, for these leaders who don't really have this kind of expertise or these concerns for them to just retire and, go get their boats and whatever, pensions and stuff. And then let us, start really taking over. That's what I'm waiting for.
I love it. And how can our listeners connect with you? Because I know they're going to be so inspired by this and want to learn more.
Yeah. As of right now, I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. So that's the easiest way, I think, for folks. Just Sbiroli MD on LinkedIn. DM me, message me, post to me. I'm always looking at it. I love connecting with professionals there. I do hope to get a website at some point. I was really inspired by yours, Andrea. Actually, I love your kind of platform that you use. And I was actually showing my cousin the other day, who's a graphic designer. I was like, look at my colleague, like, look how cool her website is. She was like, you could totally do something like that. So I was like, oh my gosh, now I'm like starstruck. So hopefully a website at some point. But for now, most of my kind of communication, I like to post studies. I like to post things on LinkedIn, different opportunities for engagement. For example, just now I posted a link to if you're a clinician and you want to sign on to a petition to help make dry powder inhalers available in the US, which have a lower climate footprint than our aerosolized components. So like, for example, if you're prescribing albuterol in the ED, those little aerosolized inhalers have a much higher carbon footprint than a powder version. But we don't use that in clinical medicine typically and kind of on a large scale in the US like they do in other countries like the UK and Canada. So there's a petition going on now for US doctors to supporting, hey, look, let's try to get some options for dry powder inhalers for our patients instead of always just using the aerosolized ones that have all these high kind of carbon footprint emitters in there, like emission pollutants. So that's an example. I like to post stuff like that. So I would say LinkedIn for now, and then hopefully a website at some point in the near future.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
It has been so wonderful having you on the podcast. And I just want to, social media is tough, but I will tell the audience that you actually are the reason I am a simulation director at the organization I work with now. You DM'd me on
Yes, I did.
Twitter, which is now X, sharing a job opportunity. So there's so many great lessons in there. Everyone should treat everyone great. That's number one. And, it doesn't take long before your residents become your colleagues. And, are at the time, we weren't, friends. I was your attending, you were a resident. We were friendly, but not friends.
Yeah.
And what the networking literature shows is that, quote, weak ties are more likely to help you get a job than a strong tie. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So tend to your networking garden. And cultivate. And, I talk about it in the book that I'm writing and that will come out this fall. This is about connections, right? I mean, I was always curious about your career. I'm very motivated by the climate change. I'm not going to do what you're doing, but I wanted to support that. And I wanted to hear, what you were doing. And by cultivating that connection, I wasn't thinking like, oh, Emily will then message me a job. That was not in my realm of thoughts. But I just want to encourage the audience, cultivate connections. And before you know it, your residents become your colleagues. So you should treat them well and teach them anyway. But sometimes it ends up coming back in a really cool way. So thank you, Emily. It's wonderful to have you as a colleague.
Well, this is our wolf pack in the making. Now we're wolf pack mates.
I love that.
This is the wolf pack. These are the wolf pack. Yeah. So, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it was amazing.
Abby Wambach's book, Wolf Pack?
No, I've never heard of that.
Oh my God. Okay. All right. So stop what you're doing right now. Anybody listening, if you have not read Abby Wambach's Wolf Pack book, which she's also adapted for, I believe, a young women adolescent version. Yeah. Well, Emily, we could do this forever. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for having me. This was amazing, Andrea. I'll see you on shift.
Thanks for listening to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their heartlines. I'd so appreciate it if you could take a quick moment and hit the like button and also the subscribe button that you'll find within your podcast app or platform that you're listening on. It also really helps if you can leave a review. I would certainly appreciate a 5-star review and a few comments about what you liked about this podcast. Don't forget, you can also forward this to people in your network. People love getting new podcasts and changing up what they're listening to. So sending a podcast to a friend or colleague, or even to start a conversation about a change that needs to happen in your organization, is a great way to be a change maker. This podcast represents the views of the host and guests. It does not represent the views of any entity we work for or with. It is also for informational use only and does not replace any professional advice, including medical or psychological. If you are interested in unlocking your true potential, reach out to me. If you're an organization interested in supporting the well-being of your people, I'd love to connect on innovative solutions. Schedule a strategy session at AndreaAustinMD.com. Sound editing services are provided by Better Podcasting Services, and you can find their website at betterpodcastingservices.com. And I'd also like to thank our future Dr. Caitlin Din, who is the production assistant for this podcast.